This report that we're studying is quite extraordinary, just a horrific read in that it describes how the agency has failed to apply the Income Tax Act fairly to all Canadians. And fairness of the system is critical in a self-reporting system. Canadians need to know that their agency is applying the law fairly. Minister, I'd like to bring to your attention on page 6 of the report. This is going to be particularly troubling to Canadians to learn that the agency would automatically allow the expense, would automatically disallow the expense as an eligible income tax deduction. That's when the agency requests a document and a taxpayer fails to provide it in 90 days. That's if you're an individual, not, for example, somebody with an offshore transaction, where it goes on to say that the agency, if the taxpayer has offshore transactions, would be allowed months or even years to comply, and in some cases the agency, having not obtained the information at all, would just close the file without assessing any taxes. So how is that applying the law fairly to Canadians and having and achieving a client-focused agency?
Thank you for that question. To begin with, I would remind my colleague that the horrors at the CRA took place during the 10 years under the Harper government. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, it is clear in black and white that the problems resulted from the cuts in the 2012 budget when the Conservative government decided to reduce the budget at the CRA by $250 million and cut hundreds of jobs. It is important that Canadians be treated fairly and that all taxpayers pay their fair share. We know, too, that all tax files are different. Some are simpler, some are more complex. The scope of the request for information and the cases, the complexity makes different. People can be in contact with the agency to be able to ask for information and get it.
Later, we know you're short in time, and I'll let Mr. Kelly go to his second question.
And we've got more time later. Minister, it's extraordinarily disappointing to hear in your 4th year as minister to have no better answer to this report than to blame the past. It's not about how many people are employed at the agency, Minister. It's about treating taxpayers fairly, about applying the law fairly to all Canadians. It's in the report, the Auditor General also describes how when the agency makes mistakes and the agency itself fails to supply information on a timely basis or gives out incorrect information, that there is no consistency in how the agency deals with penalties. So penalizing a taxpayer when the agency itself has made a mistake is extraordinarily unfair to a Canadian taxpayer, and the inconsistency around relief from penalties when the agency is at fault is something that I'm sure many Canadians would be very upset to hear when reading this report, and it would be familiar to many Canadians who have had this experience. Can you tell the committee now, what are you doing today to ensure that when the agency itself makes a mistake, that it's not penalizing taxpayers?
I would again remind my colleague, I do want to ask him for his question, which is a very important one. When we look at the cuts under the Conservative government, it's clear that there was no vision of what the CRA was to become or have as priorities toward taxpayers. And there was an important repercussion of that. We have the call centers that did not have adequate equipment. There were cuts to the services, the hours when the call centers were open, cuts to training. So I don't have any lessons to take from the conservatives. I have been minister for 3 years, and we have been better able to meet the needs of taxpayers. Last year, the Auditor General's report looked at call centers. We have modernized the call centers, and we had the SME services migrate in the beginning of December, and we have other services migrating as well. We are providing training to our call service workers to be able to better meet the needs of our clients. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the Minister for her time. She has only given us 30 minutes, which is much less than we usually have with Minister. And so I'm disappointed by this limited time we have with you. The Auditor General was very clear. There is a two-class system. We have on the one hand regular taxpayers and then others. We know that some groups have longer time frames. They have better access, they have benefits, so the rich are being treated better than other taxpayers. At the highest levels of the Trudeau government, we have people like Mr. Colbert, Mr. Bronfman, who are influential, and they are mentioned in the Panama Papers. So is this why we have this dual system? I want to thank my colleague for his important question. As I've said, I am determined and have been since I became minister to making sure that Canadians are treated fairly and that everyone pays their fair share. But every case is different. Some cases are quite simple and some are very complex. The complexity and the scope of the request for information influences the activities of the CRA. People can communicate with the agency and we can take into account their request. I asked whether rich taxpayers like Mr. Bronfman and Mr. Colbert are influencing the government. We know that Mr. Colbert, Leo Colbert, who was named in the Paradise Papers, he contributed to your election campaign. Do you not think that this sends the wrong signal to Canadians, that rich taxpayers that are mentioned in the Paradise Papers and that donate to your election campaign, do you think that sends the right signal? In my view, everyone will be treated fairly. But what about Mr. Colbert, who is mentioned in the Paradise Papers, and he contributes to you and to your campaign and the government? Everyone will be treated fairly and will be continuing to be treated fairly. This is a former senator who has been mentioned for tax haven work. As I've said, everyone will be treated fairly and equitably. But why did you not refuse that donation? What appearance does this give? What signal does it send to taxpayer? Everyone is treated fairly. And I can tell you that if you came to my riding, you would see the reputation that I have, and you would find that everyone sees that I treat all Canadians fairly. That's unfortunate because when we have rich Canadians in Montreal that contribute to your election campaign, and that they are mentioned in the Paradise Papers, and we know that the Auditor General has mentioned that rich Canadians are treated differently. But I want, with the rest of my time, to come back to another point. Last year, in December 2017, you mentioned that you are recovering $25 billion in tax evasion and that you are working on getting this money, this $25 billion, efficiently. But how much of that money has actually been recovered at this point? We have invested his record amounts of money, almost $1 billion, to deal with tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance. We hired 1,300 auditors, and we carried out twice as many audits for offshore activities as the Conservative government did. This has led to $12.5 million in court-ordered recoveries and $45.4 million in 2016-2017. But out of the $25 billion you promised just a year ago, how much has been recovered? I will ask the Commissioner to answer. No, we will have him after you've left, so we will ask him then. But just one last quick question. The last time you were here, you said that 38 convictions had been delivered for compliance activities, but you mentioned in the House 78. How many of those were for offshore activities? So over the past 3 years, how many convictions have you had for offshore tax evasion? As I said, we have hired 1,300 new audits. We have carried out twice as many audits as the 10 years as were carried out in the 10 years under Conservative government. We have 1,200 files. We have investigations into over 50 cases of offshore activities. But if that had worked, we would have had convictions by now. Thank you.
I get 5 minutes, I guess.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Minister, thank you very much for being here this morning. It is very kind of you to come here before the committee and appear. I want to express my disappointment about the campaign being led here by the opposition members to taint your reputation. We know that anyone who makes a political donation is subject to the same rules, and all Canadians have to declare their political donations, either individuals or others. I think it's $1,500 now, the limit. It's very disappointing to hear what they've had to say, but thank you for being here. I would like to raise a question, because when I listen to the two opposition questions, it seems that they are trying to make us believe that the agency is not doing its work properly to deal with fraud mentioned in the Panama Papers. Could you tell us about the progress you've made in analyzing the information in the Panama Papers in your agency? Thank you for that important question. The agency has identified over 3,000 foreign entities that are linked to some 2,600 Canadian owners. 80% of those have been looked at, and we are making sure that any Canadians mentioned in the Panama Papers no longer have access to the voluntary disclosure program. I have set up a committee to investigate how we can better apply the rules for tax evasion cases and to tighten the rules under the voluntary disclosure program to make sure that this works effectively. During the first year of my mandate, I worked closely with a number of countries to make sure that Canadians with assets in those jurisdictions no longer had access to the voluntary disclosure program. So we are making efforts to ensure that all Canadians pay their fair share. We have provided the agency with tools to better ensure compliance. And people have disclosed information before the agency began examining certain jurisdictions and having the contacts with the various countries. Can you assure me, Minister, that these actions will be effective in dealing with Canadians that were mentioned in the Panama Papers? You didn't hear my question. I understand why. There's too much conversation on the other side. Can you reassure the committee that these are unprecedented actions to deal with Canadians mentioned in the Panama Papers? Yes, of course. I want to remind all committee members that under Jean-Pierre Blackburn, who was Minister of the Canada Revenue Agency at that time, that the point of
I've just been informed that the minister will be violating the committee's request to stay for an hour, that she'll be running out the door in order to avoid tough questions on the Auditor General's report. She has said that she's just being informed now, it's quite astounding, that the minister, having received a damning report about demonstrating her personal incompetence and failure, order, that she will be heading for the hills and avoiding tough questioning in just a few moments. And if I could just finish, Mr. Chair, that is my point of order. These are important questions for which the minister is accountable to Parliament. We have a report here. It says that if the agency asked an individual to provide a receipt to support a claimed expense, and the taxpayer did not provide that receipt within 90 days, the agency would automatically disallow the expense of an eligible income tax deduction.
I think
by contrast, actually, my point of order is very much in order, and I do have the floor. By contrast, for those with offshore transactions, it goes on. For example, banks and foreign countries, they could take months to provide information to the taxpayer's offshore transactions to the agency or the taxpayer.
Your point of order was time of the minister. You're getting into the Auditor General's report.
You're right, and if I could conclude, Mr. Chair.
And it's said on the agenda.
Mr. Chair.
It's said on the agenda.
Mr. Chair.
It's said on the agenda. I'll give you time.
Point of order.
It's said on the agenda 8:15 to 8:45 for the minister. The minister agreed to stay till 8:50. Yeah. She has a cabinet meeting. You understand when you got a cabinet meeting called, you're a cabinet minister, you got to go.
Now, I understand.
The commissioner,
you said I was going to get a chance to speak.
The commissioner of the agency is here till 10:15. So there will be appropriate time. We always have the opportunity to call the minister back again.
Yeah. What I do understand about being a minister is that ministers are actually accountable to committees unless they have something to hide or are unable to answer questions. Here we have, no, excuse me. We have a report from the Auditor General, who is an officer of Parliament. It is our duty to ask questions about this report. This minister, all she's been able to do is read a few PMO talking points before running out the door and avoiding any questions about the report itself. You Mr. Chair, have allowed that to happen, just as you have done repeatedly with other ministers where you have stepped in to protect them against answering tough questions on behalf of taxpayers. Our duty here is to ask questions about this report. So I asked the minister if she will do her duty and stay here for an hour, just like this committee, with a Liberal majority, asked her to do? Will she honour the request of the committee and stay for an hour? Yes or no?
The minister has a cabinet meeting to go to. I know, Minister, can you have to go to a cabinet minister meeting, I understand. And when we sent out the agenda, we outlined in the agenda that we would only have a half an hour with the minister due to that fact.
She might. I think she's going to agree to stay for an hour.
Madam Minister.
I think she's going to agree to stay for an hour.
Monsieur Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to say to my colleague, Mr. Poilievre, that if you had wanted me for longer, I get up at 4 in the morning, so we could have started the meeting at 6 a.m. I would have been pleased to be here. But unfortunately, I have to attend the cabinet committee, so I have to leave now.
To leave, I'll let Mr. Fergus finish his question, and then we'll turn
point
to
of
the
order,
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair. I have a point of order.
Minister, thank
point
you.
Of order, Mr. Chair.
I'll go to your point of order. Thank you, Minister, for coming, and we're left with the Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner, Mr. Poilievre. And you've got about a minute left.
Yes, so this report says that taxpayers are facing harassment because the individual taxpayers face harassment so they can't provide a receipt within 90 days. While wealthy international bankers
Mr.
who have offshore foreign transactions,
you're getting into the Auditor General's
offshore foreign transactions are allowed to go for months without facing any accountability from this minister's department. And that is actually something for which we have a duty under the standing orders to ask questions, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Poilievre.
You might not like that. You might want to prevent tough questions from being asked of witnesses because you want to protect your government.
Could we come to order? Could we come to order? You're the next round of questioner. You'll get an opportunity to have 6 minutes.
You can come to order whenever you're ready to come to order. But I'm going to continue with my point of order. I'm going to continue with my point of order.
What's your point of order?
My point of order is we had a half an hour. This committee, even with a Liberal majority, asked for an hour. That minister did not answer a single question. She was asked pointed questions about this report. Instead, she buried her head in PMO talking points and went on, and if I could finish, and continued to burn our clock. The 5 minutes we had to question her.
6 minutes.
Oh, thank you. 6 minutes.
Point of order,
the 6 minutes that we had to question her, in order to get to the bottom of the details in this report, you consistently prevent us from cutting in to defend our time against that kind of abuse by ministers in your government. And then half an hour before she was supposed to leave, she gets up and runs out the door instead of answering questions about a damning Auditor General's report about the abuse of individual taxpayers and the leniency of wealthy international tax evaders. This is at the heart of what we're supposed to be doing in the Finance Committee, and I appreciate you've said before you don't like tough questions. You've said you've interrupted me. You have indeed, Mr. Chair. You've interrupted me when I've asked for yes or no questions from Minister Morneau, and now today you've allowed this minister to avoid responsibility to Parliament for a damning Auditor General's report by allowing her to testify only a half an hour when the committee asked for an hour, and by allowing her to burn what little time there was by avoiding the questions altogether. So frankly, it is the job of the chair of the committee is not to be the bodyguard of the minister. It is to facilitate parliamentarians holding ministers accountable. That is the nature of our parliamentary system.
All right.